Chapter 7 is about digital media. Digital media meaning disseminating information via, I guess, non-traditional channels, things like social media, things like websites, things like email, pretty much anything that is not in traditional paper and pencil formats. Here are some examples of different options that people have. Again, even in business communications, obviously, social communications, this is where this sort of thing really shines. But even in business communications, these are various options. You have email, which is today's day and age pretty much the same thing as paper and pen, or the takeover for traditional paper and pencil. There's instant messaging, where it could be text messaging, could be instant messaging via some sort of a web or phone platform. There's web content, in other words, putting up a website and having other people read it. There's podcasting, which traditionally is you put up something on iTunes or something like that, where it could be a broadcast that's similar to, I guess, the historical way radios were worked, where you put out instead of it being live broadcast, you put up something and people could download it. Obviously, you have to make sure that the people do download it somehow, but you could, for example, establish a podcast for the people in your company. And of course, through social networks like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, things like that. All of these things are important. Things like information sharing sites where people can upload and edit documents, wikis, content sharing sites, wikis like Google sites where anybody can edit, wikis like even Wikipedia or something like that. That of course is with that's some wiki. A wiki is defined as a site where anybody can edit. Now there could be wikis with the world like Wikipedia, or there could be wikis with your own personal company where people can contribute, like have a Google Doc or a Google Sheet that's up there, and anybody can contribute or anybody can edit at any time. It's a way to establish a collaborative process. There's blogging, which means writing commentary or articles on issues in the news. There's microblogging, short messages that are more frequent. And then, of course, there are online videos where you can make a video like I'm doing right now, and then you can post it online at a site like Vimeo or YouTube or something to that effect, and then hopefully people will actually then go ahead and watch it. Why would you want to avoid these things? Why would you actually print out a piece of paper and give it to somebody or mail it to somebody? Well, there are some examples. These are all kind of, uh, you know, downsides of social media. Making a formal impression. If you have a physical piece of paper, it might look a little nicer. It might be a better paper stock. It might have a nicer heading, whereas an email pretty much looks pretty plain, unless you have a really nice email heading. But even if you do, a piece of paper may make a little bit of a more impression. There may be legal requirements. Believe it or not, there are legal requirements that people get physical notice. That's why you get, certified mail of particular types of notifications, even though email would work just as well. But there are federal rules or state rules that have not quite caught up to the digital age, and so that's why you still have to have some notification requirements on physical piece of paper. Standing out from the digital message flood, you might get 100. If you're like me, you might get 100, 150 emails a day without, and just one more email, especially if it's to somebody who you don't really know that well or gets a lot of communications, you might not be able to, to get into that person's radar, get into that person's conscience. Making permanent, unchangeable, or secure records. Emails can be deleted. It's hard to prove, even if you have a digital receipt, it's hard to prove the person actually saw it or the person actually read it. A physical piece of paper that's signed for, on the other hand, it's a little bit easier to establish a paper trail. These are some advantages, but that again, that doesn't mean you're going to always use printed messages. Nobody's going to always use printed messages. In today's day and age, most communications are probably going to be digital, no matter what you do. But the thing is, sometimes there could actually be advantages of printed messages. How do you go about establishing digital communications? In other words, what are some types of digital communications? You could have communications like chains, comments on something like, in Microsoft Word has, or any Microsoft has these things where, or well, many of the programs have track changes where you can have somebody else look at the comments you make on something. You can use that on Google Sites and Google Docs as well. Summaries, reference materials, all these things are just examples of things that can be done digitally. Narratives, teasers, where these are all things that could be done in paper, but they're cheaper and easier to do from social media. I'm going to, big news coming tomorrow. A lot easier to do that by an email chain or a mass text message than it is to give physical pieces of paper to everybody saying something big coming tomorrow. Status updates, announcements, tutorials using YouTube, using videos can be a lot easier. Given the community nature of social media, where anybody can see what you're doing, the purpose of many messages is to establish how something can be done, share how-to advice, something to that effect. Could be important. Social media can efficiently and easily do these things. The advantage of digital communications in general is that they're much more efficient. You can do a lot of them for virtually no money or resources. It's, quite easy to do. Okay, how do you go about this is the idea of optimizing content for mobile devices. And what that means is trying to make sure that whatever you sent out is specifically tailored and geared towards electronic communications. Most communications that we make could be just as easily made for physical paper or sent by email, but we do it by email because it's cheaper, it's faster, it's quicker, it's easier. It's you have everything, all your communications in one place. But there are also ways to make sure that your content is specifically tailored and specifically good for mobile communications, where it looks good on a phone. It's particularly suited for phones. We discussed this a little bit in earlier chapters, where people who read messages on phones very often read one sentence or a couple of sentences at a time on their phone. So you want to make sure that the sentences are more standalone than in entire memoranda. But here are some other examples: location-based services, which are social networks that are confined to a particular area, maybe a store, maybe if you have a conference, there are apps that allow you to communicate with everybody at a conference. Gamification, which is something that many sites do, that kind of like give you points for logging in and give you points for viewing different pages. Things like Khan Academy, where if you're watching a Khan Academy video for a few minutes, all of a sudden something pops up that says, "Congratulations, you've watched 5 minutes of this video." Now you haven't really accomplished anything, but it's kind of a little bit of a feedback mechanism that gets you a little bit of a tiny little sense of accomplishment that I guess inspires you to go forward. That's the idea of gamification. Augmented reality, which means giving additional information through various media. For example, when you're giving a presentation, you might have a webcam that shows an image of you, or you might have graphs or charts that come up, sort of thing that may be very difficult to do on the phone or by paper, unless you want to put the actual data on the paper itself, which usually is harder to do. But when you're doing a video, you can have, and you're talking about statistics, you can have a little graph with those statistics pop up. It can make things even more effective, and it's the sort of thing that could make digital communication even more effective than non-digital communication. Wearable technology, this has to do with things like virtual reality and even increased ability to bombard your reader or listener with more media. Mobile blogging, which means using devices, something to use sites like Twitter, whatever it is, to get out quick messages from wherever you are. You don't have to be at a computer. You could be at your phone and pop out. Now it's a little more. It used to be only 140 characters on Twitter. Now I think it's 280. But whatever it is, the point is you can do really short, really quick messages from anywhere. Mobile podcasting, today you can actually, on a phone or a tablet, you can create the podcast. You don't even need the studio equipment that you used to use, that people used to use, or they still use it for better sound quality, but it's not 100% necessary. And cloud-based services means using things on the cloud, with services like Dropbox or Google Drive or whatnot, to not actually have to email documents, but just kind of email links to documents to 100 different people. It's a lot easier than emailing the document to 100 different people. Also, documents could be very big. Putting things on cloud services, which means hosted, by some service that's always on and not on your particular computer, that people can access all the time. These are some ways in which you can improve the usability for social media and digital content in general. Okay, what's the examples? What's the email is really kind of the first major topic that we're going to look at over here in terms of using email in the office place. Now, using email in the office is like using, a wristwatch. I mean, everybody has one. Well, Not even people who don't have wristwatches have email. You have if you have a white collar job, you have to be able to use email, obviously. The advantage of email, well, it's universal, which means everybody has it. You don't have to have a particular type of phone or a particular type of computer. Everybody has email. It's private, relatively private. Again, there are some security risks, but it accommodates longer messages than things like text messages. You can write it pretty much as short or as long as you want. One advantage is that it's not instantaneous, where when you're talking to somebody on the phone or on a web chat, you might want to think about what you say. And just like any type of written communication, you can edit it and you can think about it before you actually send it. That could be a big advantage. You can use scheduling via email. You can schedule conferences. You can schedule meetings. In Web Outlook. You can also plan meetings in advance. Email is very good for that. And of course, access. You can access it on pretty much anything in today's day and age. Tablets, phones, computers, whatever you want to access your email on, you can. Um, there are some disadvantages of email. One is that it's, kind of too easy to use. It can be used so much and by so many people that people get kind of inundated and swamped, with a lot of low value messages. Out of those 150 emails I get a day, probably, half of them or more than half of them even are the sorts of things that I don't really have to pay much attention to. And it kind of gives me the idea of, well, not every email is important. And some people, because of that, don't pay as much attention to emails as they do to physical notes or phone calls or something to that effect. Also, people get spam, which means marketing emails. You want to cruise to Bermuda? I guess you can get that by phone also. But emails, you get a whole bunch of these every day. I'm sure we all get spam emails. That kind of devalues the entire medium. And of course, if you're not careful, you can get hacked by computer viruses, phishing scams, where they say, if you're a Bank of America customer, put in your username and password. We need your username and password. And be very careful about those things. Obviously, it could be just a scam to get your username and password. There are ways you can kind of tell whether something's a phishing scam, like the email that they send, the link that they send you to. Does that look like it's really from the company, or is it bankofamerica.com, or is it bankofamerica.xyz.com? If it's the latter, then it's almost certainly a scam. You got to be very careful when you look at the URL. The URL might contain the name of the company, but is that the end of the URL? Is it Amazon.com, or is it Amazon Web dot you know shopping.com or something like that, where the URL looks a little funny? If so, it's probably a phishing scam. Email messages, although they're very quick, they're ubiquitous and easy to send, they do have to be planned. Is there a valid related purpose? Does it comply with your policies and ethics? It shouldn't be informal. It shouldn't be disrespectful. It shouldn't be insensitive. Remember, there's evidence. Everything you send, it's one thing if you say something by phone, it may not be remembered precisely, but if there's email, there's a paper trail. Everything you send, you have to assume that people are going to see it. You have to assume that if the company gets sued or if there's a problem later on, that email is going to be subject to discovery. People are going to see that email. So you want to analyze the situation like when you send any kind of written communication. You have to gather the information, organize the message, be careful about sending it. Just because something is very easy to send doesn't mean you should send it right away. Pretend you were sending a physical letter. It may be quicker, it may be easier to send, but it's no less important, certainly. There is a higher expectation of quality when you're talking about email messages. When you email your friend about something, you might use the number two instead of to. You might use the number four instead of for. You can't do that in an email. There's an expectation that the grammar will be appropriate, the sentence structure will be appropriate, that you'll use appropriate capitalization, use appropriate grammar. I get emails all the time. Like I said, I get many, many emails from different people, and one of the things that's very unimpressive is when you get an email from somebody and they didn't bother to capitalize the word I, or didn't bother to capitalize their name, or didn't bother to sign their name, or didn't bother to explain what you're talking about. If you get an email from a student, can I have an extension, or can I submit something by this date, and they don't bother to say which course they're talking about, and they don't bother to say which what they're referring to, or which assignment. Very, very, very unimpressive. It doesn't mean you don't help them. You might try to help them anyway if you're nice about it, but it's extremely unimpressive, and it could cause you to to not look at that person as somebody that's worthy of your full undivided attention, even if it's such subconsciously. Informative and compelling subject lines. In the read line, don't just say question. Say what the question is about. Or some people don't bother to put any heading. That's always an ominous sign, because if there's nothing in the subject line, usually it's spam, or usually it's just the email is not important. Doesn't mean it's always not important, but if you send an email to somebody, make sure to put in the subject line, meeting next Thursday, or sale to ABC Corporation, or something like that, or writing assignments 3 and 4, something like that. At least the reader understands what they're reading about, rather than just having to guess. You want the reader to at least be in the frame of mind to read your email carefully when they start. Opening words extend the subject lines. I am writing about XYZ, or about regarding XYZ, this is my question, whatever it is, and XYZ should be in the subject line. Use emoticons wisely and sparingly if it's a business communication. Smiley faces, sad faces, winks, things like that. I'm not saying there's never any place for it, especially if it's somebody you work with. If it's your colleague and you joke around with them a lot and whatever it is, that could be fine. But if you're writing to somebody, somebody who's a client, somebody who you're doing business with, I'm not saying you can never use emoticons, but be careful with them. People may take them the wrong way. Remember, it's very difficult. Sarcasm is very difficult to convey in the written word, so be very careful about those. Revise, proofread. Both very important. Don't just assume that because it's an email, people are going to take it as they would take an offhand comment. Assume that everything you write should at least have the same kind of structure and at least the same kind of care as you're talking about any business communication. Be cautious about reply all. When you click reply all, it means that everybody on the chain of emails gets the response. If you get something to you and 10 other people in your office and hit reply all, everybody's going to get it. If you were, being critical or having a question that's only relevant to the person that sent it, hit just reply rather than reply all. Reply all can be a great tool. Especially in a small company where you want everybody to know what's going on at every aspect. You hit reply all, and on an email that was sent to everybody in the company, then everybody else in the company is kept in the loop. That's great. But on the other hand, if you hit reply all, you may be sending the message to people who may not really be appropriate to. Maybe you're complaining about something. Maybe you're asking a question that's only relevant to somebody. Maybe it's something personal that somebody else shouldn't know. So if you do hit reply all, carefully look through all the people on the subject line and make sure that they should all get it. Remember, you could hit reply all and then delete one or two of the recipients. Nothing wrong with that, but it is something to be very careful about. It's always, once you send it, it's too late. I've had people send messages they shouldn't have sent, and then try to recall it or say, "Don't look at the email I just sent you." Saying "Don't look at the email I just sent you" is the perfect way to guarantee that they actually do read the email very, very carefully, because human nature is to be curious about things, and even if they're not doing it maliciously, you get an email, then somebody says, "Don't read what I just sent you." That what the first thing that pops in your mind is, "Wow, I wonder what was so important that they had to try to recall it," which never ever works. So be careful before you send it, because once you send it, it's too late. Don't flag everything with high priority. You can if it really is very important, but if you start flagging everything with high priority, then people realize you're just crying wolf, and they don't actually pay attention to your flagging. Messaging, which is private messaging or text messaging, whatever it is. Of course, there are advantages that it can happen very quickly, and you can choose your participants to who to message. But on the other hand, especially when you're talking about a phone, it can be a pain in the neck to type. It used to be much harder. Now it's a little easier to type from a phone, but it still can be, more tedious typing from a phone than typing from your computer. There's also an increased risk of communication when you're talking about messaging, because the messages are so short and they're a little less formal. And again, there's very little you can do to convey sarcasm. So if you want to be sarcastic, call the person and speak to the person, or speak to the person face to face, even better. Something in your voice or something in your eyes, something in your face can convey sarcasm or facetiousness or skepticism. Very hard to convey that sort of thing in an email, and it's really subject to misinterpretation. Planning, writing, and completing, of course, is the same process that we discussed with any written communication, but this also applies, even though you might not think it should apply for such informal communication, it definitely should. And some tips for effective messaging. Be thoughtful and courteous. Don't be quick. And one of the things about being courteous, by the way, is giving the reader all the information that they need rather than just, leaving the reader to figure out what you're talking about. Use unavailable feature. There very often you can put a feature like on WhatsApp or something like that that you're not that you're busy. You can put up a feature so that somebody when they email you or text you or WhatsApp you, they might expect a response within a few minutes unless you have something there that says unavailable. If there's a response and you don't get back for a few hours, the person might think that you're ignoring him, whereas what you're actually doing is you're at the gym or you're spending time with your kids or whatever it is. Make sure to keep that. If you can make an unavailability message, you can decrease, maybe kind of like an ill feeling that might ensue otherwise. Use caution when sending personal messages. Obviously, you don't want those to go in a business context. Don't use for impromptu meetings. Again, if you have to have a meeting with people, use a conference call. Use physical meeting space, something like that. It's always using WhatsApp is not always going to do the job. Use for short, simple messages, security, all things that are obviously very important. Website content means putting up material on the internet. It could be something internal or it could be something external for the world. It's versatile. The great thing about putting up a web page is that you can put up one statement or one paragraph or one report or whatever it is, and hundreds or thousands of people can read it over the course of any period of time, over the course of days or weeks or months or whatever it is. It isn't as versatile. It isn't as versatile, and it isn't as easy to plan. When people see a website, they expect it to look nice, which means it's going to take longer to write. It's going to take longer to plan. It's going to if there's an error in it. If it's a text message and there's a mistake in it, people will forgive it. If there's an email, people will understand. If you put up a website and there are mistakes in it, people are going to think, there's a little bit of lack of professionalism going on. It does take longer to put up something on the web and because you have to plan for it. So it may be ideal for mass communications where you have the time and the energy to make a nice website. Otherwise, maybe not. The thing about a website, this informational architecture, is based on the idea that on the web, there's not necessarily a beginning, middle, and end. On most websites, there's a page, and users can bounce around between pages based on links. So you have to assume that any page that the reader gets to is the can be the only page that he or she reads. So, don't put a web page that's not self-contained, that can't be read without any other page. If there is, if there's a page that is introductory to another page, well, then link to the first page. Put on top, say, please see this page first, and link to it. Then it makes it easier on the reader. The recent trend toward one-page websites, just to kind of give you one piece of information and assume that each page is kind of a self-contained universe and each page should have its own self-contained message or should again at least link to the pages that are necessary for the information for that page. Organizational websites, you want to try to make it as well organized as possible for the reader based on what the likely reader's goal is. Brainstorm likely usage. In other words, who is going to come to this site and why? What do they want to know? And based on what they want to know, give them that information. If it's your LinkedIn profile, what do they want to know? They want to know, your job history. They don't want to know, what your favorite flavor ice cream is, or where you went for last summer vacation. That might be great for your Facebook page, or maybe all the way at the bottom of your LinkedIn page. But at the beginning of your LinkedIn profile, people want to know what your experience is, what your education is, what you've been doing recently, things like that. You can create a sitemap or a visual tool to allow people to make a determination of what information is where. Easy return to the top level of the site. Back, like a little back button on the site, or a home button to allow people to get back to where they were a page ago, rather than having to use the back button of their browser, which can be a little bit more complex, especially if the page loads various type of players. Search options, it's very easy to put a search bar into a website using Google search feature. The Google engine will search your site. Very easy to do. It always helps, especially if it's a complex site with lots of information. And of course, be consistent with labels. You want to make sure that you don't use different names for the same page at various points of your site. You're just going to confuse people if you do it that way. Build audience trust by establishing useful information and reliable information. Readable chunks of information. Again, here are just some general ideas for making good and effective web pages. Podcasting means e- establishing a usually kind of like a radio format page, an audio or even video. We could have video podcasts also, where you put it up on a website like iTunes or a link to your site on YouTube or something like that, where you can give information to people. You can use it for training, marketing, selling, recruiting. You can use it for pretty much anything. It's a mass information tool where you can do something a lot more than just a web page, because a web page is limited to reading, whereas a podcast can do audio and or visual materials. You can do it for any of those things. And obviously, again, we've got that three-step plan that we've used in many, many different contexts. Analyze the situation, organize the material, gather the information that's necessary, that's useful for the reader, write it. Again, writing doesn't necessarily mean writing every word when you're planning something. It means cue cards and giving yourself some general ideas of what to say. Like in this course, you'll be doing a sales presentation. You're not going to write every single word, but what you are going to do is write the bullet points of what you want to cover. And then at the end, you can revise and edit your script or your bullet points or whatever it is that's going to give you the cues in terms of what to say, and then actually record it and distribute it.